In the early years of the Second World War, when engineers across the world were racing to build faster, higher-flying, more heavily armed fighters, one American aircraft stood apart from the rest. It did not look radically different at first glance. It had sleek lines, a tricycle landing gear, and a low, purposeful stance on the runway. But hidden inside its compact fuselage was something few fighters of its time dared to carry: a large-caliber cannon firing through the nose. This was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Designed by Bell Aircraft in the late 1930s, the P-39 reflected bold, unconventional thinking. Most fighters of the era mounted their engines in the nose. Bell's engineers did something different. They placed the Allison V-1710 engine behind the pilot in the middle of the fuselage. A long drive shaft ran beneath the cockpit floor, connecting the engine to the propeller at the front. This unusual layout freed the nose for a weapon rarely seen on a single-engine fighter: a 37mm cannon. At a time when many fighters relied on rifle caliber or heavy machine guns, the idea of mounting a cannon of that size was dramatic. The weapon chosen for the Airacobra was the M4 37mm. It fired explosive shells capable of tearing apart aircraft structures with a single well-placed hit. The cannon was aligned to fire directly through the propeller hub, a precision engineering feat that allowed the pilot to aim simply by pointing the entire aircraft at the target. On paper, it sounded devastating. The United States Army Air Corps had initially envisioned the P-39 as a high-altitude interceptor. Early prototypes even included a turbo supercharger to maintain engine performance in thin air. But during development, that turbo supercharger was removed. The result was an aircraft that performed best at low to medium altitudes. While this limited its effectiveness as a high-altitude escort fighter over Europe, it created a different kind of opportunity elsewhere. When America entered the war in December 1941, the P-39 was already in service. Pilots quickly discovered both its strengths and its weaknesses. Without its turbo supercharger, the aircraft struggled above 15,000 feet. Against high-flying enemy aircraft, especially in Europe, it was at a disadvantage. But at lower altitudes, the Airacobra was fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed. And in the Pacific theater, much of the fighting happened low. Island warfare in the Pacific was brutal, close, and often conducted at treetop height. Dogfights unfolded above jungles and coastlines. Japanese aircraft, such as the A6M-0, were highly maneuverable but lightly armored. Against such opponents, the Airacobra's 37mm cannon could be terrifying. American pilots described the cannon as both powerful and temperamental. It carried limited ammunition, typically around 30 rounds. Each shell had to count. The weapon fired relatively slowly compared to machine guns, and its recoil was significant. But when it hit, the effect was dramatic. A single explosive round could shatter an enemy fighter, rip through a bomber's fuselage, or ignite fuel tanks in an instant. Combat reports from the Pacific describe instances where one accurate burst of a P-39 ended a fight immediately. Pilots learned to close in tight before firing, conserving ammunition until they were certain of the shot. In many engagements, the Airacobra's nose cannon turned short, violent encounters decisively in America's favor. The aircraft also carried .50 caliber machine guns in the nose and additional guns in the wings depending on the variant, but it was the cannon that defined the P-39's identity. It gave the aircraft a reputation as a blunt instrument, not a scalpel, but a hammer. While the P-39's performance over Western Europe proved disappointing compared to newer fighters like the P-51 Mustang, it found more success in other hands. The Soviet Union, through Lend-Lease agreements, received thousands of Airacobras. Soviet pilots, fighting at lower altitudes on the Eastern Front, used the aircraft effectively against German bombers and fighters. Several Soviet aces scored many of their victories in the P-39, exploiting its heavy armament and solid low-level handling. But in the Pacific, where American forces struggled through the early, uncertain years of the war, the Airacobra filled an important role. It flew missions over New Guinea and supported operations in the Solomon Islands. Pilots strafed ground targets, attacked barges supplying Japanese troops, and provided air cover for amphibious landings. These missions revealed something important. The 37mm cannon was not only effective against aircraft, it was devastating against lightly armored ground targets and small vessels. Japanese forces often relied on barges to move supplies between islands under cover of darkness. These barges were difficult to detect and harder to destroy with conventional weapons. But when struck by a 37mm explosive shell, they could be blown apart. Reports filtered back through command channels. The Airacobra's cannon was proving useful in roles beyond air-to-air combat. At the same time, the U.S. Navy was fighting its own desperate battles in the narrow waters of the Solomon Islands. Small, fast patrol torpedo boats, PT boats, operated at night, hunting enemy shipping. Armed primarily with torpedoes and machine guns, these wooden vessels relied on speed and surprise. But torpedoes were not always ideal. They were designed for larger ships. Against small barges or lightly protected targets, torpedoes were often excessive or ineffective. Naval commanders faced a challenge. The Japanese were running supplies down the slot, the narrow stretch of water between islands, using destroyers at night and barges by day. American forces needed weapons capable of delivering heavy firepower quickly and accurately against small, fast, and lightly armored targets. Some officers began to think creatively. The Army Air Corps had already demonstrated that a relatively small platform, a single-engine fighter, could carry and effectively use a 37mm cannon. If an aircraft could absorb the recoil and deliver accurate fire, could a small boat do the same? It was not an immediate or simple idea. Naval vessels traditionally mounted deck guns designed specifically for maritime use. Aircraft cannons were engineered for different stresses, different mounting systems, and different firing conditions. Yet the logic was compelling. The M4 cannon was compact, powerful, and already in production. It had proven its lethality in the skies over the Pacific. By 1942, as fighting intensified around Guadalcanal, innovation became a necessity. Both the Army and the Navy were adapting equipment in the field, modifying weapons, and improvising solutions. The boundaries between services sometimes blurred under the pressure of survival. The P-39 Airacobra's unusual design had unintentionally created a bridge between air and sea warfare. Its mid-engine configuration had allowed engineers to place a heavy cannon in the nose, a weapon that, in the right circumstances, could act as a compact naval gun. For pilots, the cannon was a symbol of the aircraft's identity, powerful, direct, unforgiving. For engineers and tacticians watching the war unfold in the Pacific, it represented something else: possibility. The idea of mounting aircraft weapons on boats was not entirely new. Field modifications were already common. PT crews added extra machine guns, improvised armor, and heavier weapons whenever they could obtain them. In the harsh environment of jungle warfare, official doctrine often gave way to practical necessity. The success of the P-39's 37mm cannon against barges and postal targets planted a seed.
If air power could shatter small vessels from above, perhaps similar firepower mounted at sea level could dominate narrow channels and nighttime supply routes. The Airacobra itself would never become the most celebrated fighter of the war. It lacked the high-altitude performance of later designs. It did not escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Yet its story is one of adaptation, of finding strength in a role different than what designers first imagined. In the humid airfields of the South Pacific, where mechanics worked under palm trees and pilots flew into sudden tropical storms, the Airacobra proved that heavy firepower on a small platform could change the balance of a fight. And as the war pressed on, that lesson would travel from the sky down to the sea. In the darkness of Pacific nights, in waters crowded with reefs and enemy barges, American sailors would soon experiment with a radical idea, taking the brute force of an aircraft's nose cannon.
By mid-1942, the war in the Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm. The headlines spoke of aircraft carriers and battleships, of grand naval clashes across open ocean. But in the narrow waters between jungle islands, a different kind of war was unfolding, close, chaotic, and unforgiving. The Solomon Islands became the center of this struggle. After U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the fight turned into a grinding contest of supply and survival. Whoever could move men, ammunition, and food across the water at night would control the islands by day. The Japanese relied on speed and stealth. Under cover of darkness, destroyers raced down what American sailors nicknamed the slot, delivering troops and equipment before vanishing before sunrise. When larger ships became too vulnerable, the Japanese turned to smaller wooden barges. These low-profile craft slipped along coastlines and river mouths, carrying rice, ammunition, and reinforcements to isolated garrisons. Stopping them was harder than it sounded. The U.S. Navy deployed patrol torpedo boats, PT boats, to counter this traffic. These were small, fast, wooden vessels about 80 feet long, powered by 3 Packard engines. They were lightly armored, lightly built, and extraordinarily quick. Their primary weapon was the torpedo, designed to cripple or sink large enemy ships. But the Pacific War was not always a torpedo war. Torpedoes were expensive, limited in number, and often unreliable in the early years. Against a massive cruiser, they were essential. Against a small wooden barge hugging the shoreline, they were impractical. PT crews needed something else, something that could deliver immediate, concentrated firepower at close range. At first, the solution was improvisation. Crewmen mounted extra .50 caliber machine guns wherever they could. Some boats added 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Field modifications became common. PT sailors were resourceful, often installing weapons salvaged from aircraft or other ships. The official configuration of a boat was only the beginning. What it carried into combat depended on what the crew could acquire and bolt down securely. Meanwhile, lessons from the air were impossible to ignore. Army Air Forces pilots flying the Bell P-39 Airacobra had demonstrated how devastating a 37mm cannon could be against light vessels and shoreline targets. Strafing runs against Japanese barges often ended in a single explosive burst. The shell would detonate on impact, splintering wood and igniting fuel. Barges shattered, supply lines faltered. Naval officers took notice. The logic was straightforward. If a fighter aircraft weighing several tons could absorb the recoil of a 37mm cannon in mid-air, surely a boat skimming across relatively calm water could mount a similar weapon. The challenge lay in engineering and balance. PT boats were built for speed. They were not designed to carry heavy deck guns that could destabilize the hull. But necessity breeds bold thinking. In the shipyards and forward bases of the South Pacific, experimentation began.
Some PT boats were fitted with larger caliber weapons removed from damaged aircraft. Others received 40mm Bofors guns scavenged from Army stockpiles. The idea was always the same: increase forward firepower for night engagements. The concept evolved gradually rather than through a single dramatic decision. Crews wanted a weapon that could punch through enemy barges and suppress shoreline defenses instantly without expending precious torpedoes. They needed accuracy, destructive force, and the ability to fire quickly at short range. Engineers and armorers examined available weapons. Aircraft cannons were compact compared to traditional naval guns. They were designed to fit within tight fuselages, to operate under vibration and stress. In theory, they could be adapted to a boat's deck with reinforced mounts and structural support. Yet mounting such a weapon was not simply a matter of bolting it down. Recoil management was critical. A 37mm cannon generated substantial backward force when fired. On a fighter plane, that force was distributed through the airframe. On a wooden PT boat, poorly managed recoil could damage the deck or throw off aim after each shot. Stability had to be considered. Weight distribution mattered. Too much mass forward could alter how the boat rode waves at high speed. Despite the risks, field modifications continued. Reports from the Solomon Islands described nighttime clashes in tight waters where PT boats closed to within a few hundred yards of enemy targets. In such close quarters, the side that delivered the first accurate burst often prevailed. The thunder of heavier guns echoing across dark water carried psychological weight as well. Japanese barge crews were accustomed to machine gun fire. They were less prepared for explosive shells tearing through wooden hulls in sudden flashes of light. As the campaign wore on, the Navy recognized that the nature of PT boat warfare was changing. Originally conceived as torpedo attackers against capital ships, the boats were increasingly serving as gunboats, hunting barges, providing fire support for Marines, and patrolling rivers and coastlines. By late 1942 and into 1943, some PT boats began losing torpedo tubes to make room for heavier armament. This transformation reflected hard-earned experience. Torpedoes were powerful but specialized. Guns were flexible. In the shallow waters around Guadalcanal and New Georgia, flexibility was survival. The spirit behind these changes was not reckless innovation, it was adaptation under pressure. Commanders understood that small boats operating at night faced enormous risks. Japanese destroyers were heavily armed and fast. Shore batteries could open fire without warning. Aircraft might appear at dawn. PT crews operated in darkness, navigating reefs and enemy patrols with limited radar and uncertain intelligence. To give them more firepower was to give them a better chance. Some of the most dramatic encounters occurred when PT boats surprised Japanese barge convoys moving along jungle shorelines. Closing in silently had reduced speed, engines throttled back, American crews would wait for the right moment. Then, suddenly, searchlights would snap on and guns would erupt. The introduction of heavier cannons amplified these moments. Instead of the steady chatter of machine guns alone, there came the deeper boom of larger shells. Splinters flew, fuel ignited. The night lit up with brief, violent flashes. Japanese reports from the region began noting the increased aggressiveness and firepower of American small craft. Though documentation varies, accounts from veterans on both sides suggest that some Japanese sailors referred to certain heavily armed PT boats with ominous nicknames, expressions of frustration and respect for their unexpected lethality. What had started as a torpedo platform was becoming something entirely else. The transformation was gradual but decisive. By reinforcing decks, adjusting weight distribution, and carefully mounting heavier weapons forward, the Navy was effectively creating hybrid vessels, part torpedo boat, part gunboat. The influence of aircraft weaponry lingered in these decisions. The P-39 Airacobra had shown that a compact mobile platform could deliver outsized firepower if engineered correctly. Its nose-mounted 37mm cannon was proof that size alone did not determine striking power. Now, at sea level, a similar philosophy was taking shape. These developments did not occur in isolation. Across the Pacific theater, American forces were improvising constantly. Marines modified equipment in jungle workshops. Army engineers adapted vehicles for muddy terrain. Naval crews altered ships in forward anchorages. The Devil Boat concept, though not yet formalized under that name, was part of this wider culture of innovation. By early 1943, the pattern was clear. PT boats were no longer defined solely by torpedoes. Their silhouettes changed as extra guns appeared. Their tactics shifted from single torpedo runs to sustained gunnery engagements. They were becoming close-range predators, stalking barges and coastal positions with increasing confidence. The transition from sky to sea was not about copying an aircraft exactly. It was about applying a lesson. Concentrated firepower on a small, agile platform could alter the balance of a fight. And in the dark waters of the Solomons, balance was everything. Soon, certain boats would push this evolution even further, stripping away torpedoes entirely, embracing the gunboat role, and redefining what a tiny wooden vessel could accomplish in wartime. The idea had begun with an aircraft's nose cannon. Now, it was reshaping the war at sea.
Night fell quickly in the Solomon Islands. One moment, the jungle canopy glowed under a fading orange sky. The next, darkness swallowed the coastline. There were no city lights, no distant glow on the horizon, only black water, humid air, and the constant drone of insects drifting from shore. For the men aboard American PT boats, night was both shield and battlefield. After the U.S. landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942, control of the surrounding seas became a matter of survival. Japanese forces needed to reinforce their troops. American forces needed to stop them. Larger naval engagements grabbed headlines, but the real struggle often unfolded in narrow channels and coastal inlets where small craft moved unseen. PT boats were assigned one of the most dangerous tasks of the campaign, intercepting Japanese supply runs under cover of darkness. The enemy adapted quickly. When daylight transport proved too vulnerable to air attack, Japanese commanders turned to nighttime operations. Destroyers raced down the slot, delivering troops and cargo in high-speed runs, later known as the Tokyo Express. When destroyers became too valuable to risk, wooden barges took over the job, creeping along jungle coastlines, hugging the shadows. From a distance, these barges were almost invisible. They rode low in the water, their engines were quiet. Crews often cut power and drifted when they suspected danger. Spotting them required patience, sharp eyes, and sometimes luck. American PT crews learned to navigate by instinct. Radar was primitive and unreliable in tight waters. Reefs lurked just below the surface. Sudden squalls reduced visibility to nothing. Engines had to be managed carefully, loud enough to maneuver, quiet enough to avoid detection. On a typical patrol, a PT boat would slip away from its base after sunset. Engines rumbling low, the wooden hull slicing through dark water at reduced speed. The crew stood at their stations, gunners behind .50 caliber machine guns, a lookout straining into the darkness, the captain peering ahead through binoculars that revealed almost nothing. Then, sometimes, a shape would emerge. A faint silhouette against the slightly lighter line of jungle, a ripple where there should be stillness, a shadow moving across darker shadow. Contact. The captain would signal silently. Engines throttled forward. The boat accelerated, its 3 Packard engines roaring to life. In seconds, the PT boat could reach speeds over 35 knots. Surprise was everything. Early in the campaign, torpedoes were the primary weapon, but against barges, torpedoes were often wasted.
The small wooden craft were too light. Torpedoes could pass beneath them or fail to detonate properly. Crews increasingly relied on gunfire instead. By late 1942 and into 1943, many PT boats operating around Guadalcanal and nearby islands had reinforced their forward firepower. Some carried 20mm cannons, others mounted heavier guns salvaged or adapted in the field. The shift was deliberate. When you closed to within a few hundred yards, you wanted immediate, overwhelming force. When the first shots were fired, the night exploded into chaos. Machine guns erupted with bright orange tracers slicing across the water. The heavier cannons followed with deeper concussive blasts. Explosive shells struck wooden hulls and detonated in splintering flashes. Fuel drums ignited. Barges broke apart under concentrated fire. For the crews on those barges, the attack felt sudden and supernatural. One moment, only darkness. The next, roaring engines and flashes of fire tearing through the night. Some Japanese after-action reports described the difficulty of identifying these attackers. The PT boats were small, fast, and aggressive. They struck quickly and withdrew just as fast, vanishing back into darkness before heavier ships could respond. The psychological effect was significant. Japanese forces had expected American naval strength to come from cruisers and destroyers. Instead, they faced tiny wooden boats delivering bursts of heavy gunfire at close range. In the confined waters of the Solomons, where maneuvering room was limited, even a small craft with powerful guns could become a serious threat. For American crews, the work was relentless. Patrol after patrol, night after night. Sleep was scarce. Engines required constant maintenance in the corrosive salt air. The tropical climate punished both men and machines. Malaria spread through the islands. Supplies were limited. And the enemy adapted. Japanese destroyers sometimes escorted barge convoys, turning the hunter into the hunted. A PT boat caught in the open against a destroyer's main guns stood little chance. Shore batteries concealed in jungle foliage could open fire without warning. Searchlights from enemy positions could pin a boat in blinding white beams, turning it into a target. In such moments, speed and aggression were the only defense. Captains ordered full throttle, zigzagging at high speed to throw off enemy aim. Gunners fired back at flashes on shore. The sea churned white behind fleeing boats as shells splashed dangerously close. The transformation of PT boats into more heavily armed gun platforms proved decisive in many of these encounters. Extra cannons allowed them to suppress shore positions quickly and damage barges decisively. Instead of relying on a single torpedo strike, crews could deliver sustained fire, adapting mid-fight as conditions changed. Guadalcanal became a testing ground for these tactics. Between August 1942 and early 1943, the waters around the island saw some of the fiercest small boat actions of the war. PT squadrons operated from makeshift bases, including Tulagi and later Rendova. Crews learned which channels were safest, which coves concealed enemy movements, which nights favored ambush. The term devil boats began circulating in recollections of the campaign, a reflection of how these small craft were perceived when they struck without warning. Whether the nickname was formal or informal mattered less than the reality behind it. The PT boats had become something unexpected. They were no longer simply torpedo carriers designed to attack capital ships. They were night hunters, agile gun platforms capable of shredding supply lines and harassing larger forces. Their impact extended beyond immediate destruction. Every barge sunk meant fewer supplies reaching Japanese troops ashore. Every disrupted convoy slowed reinforcement efforts. In jungle warfare, logistics determined survival. By attacking the flow of food and ammunition, PT boats indirectly shaped the ground campaign. There were losses, too. Some boats were hit by return fire, others struck reefs in the darkness. Crews were wounded, sometimes killed. The wooden construction that made PT boats light and fast also made them vulnerable. A direct hit from a destroyer's shell could be catastrophic. Yet the patrols continued.
As the campaign shifted northward toward New Georgia and Kolombangara, PT boats followed. Their tactics evolved further. Additional guns appeared. Torpedo tubes were sometimes removed entirely to make room for heavier armament. The lessons learned in the Solomons were clear. Concentrated firepower on a small, fast platform could dominate confined waters at night. What had begun as an experimental adaptation was becoming doctrine. The Pacific night belonged not only to destroyers and cruisers, but to these small wooden predators slicing through black water at high speed, engines roaring, guns ready, and crews alert for the faintest shadow ahead. In the darkness, size meant less than surprise. And in that darkness, the legend of the so-called devil boats grew, forged in muzzle flashes, engine smoke, and the violent echo of cannon fire across jungle-lined shores.
By 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. Guadalcanal was secure, but the fighting had not eased. Instead, it shifted north and west. New Georgia, Kolombangara, Bougainville. Each island meant another stretch of hostile coastline, another maze of reefs and jungle channels, another night battleground where supply lines decided who lived and who starved. For the U.S. Navy's PT boat squadrons, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The torpedo boat was evolving. Originally designed as fast attack craft meant to strike large enemy ships with torpedoes, PT boats were increasingly fighting smaller, closer, more chaotic battles. They were intercepting barges, providing fire support for marine landings, engaging shore batteries at close range, operating in waters too shallow or dangerous for destroyers. The torpedo, once their defining weapon, was no longer always the most useful. Commanders began making bold decisions. Instead of carrying 4 torpedoes, some boats would remove them entirely. In their place, heavier guns were mounted. Extra ammunition filled storage racks. Decks were reinforced to handle recoil. The boats were becoming gun platforms, aggressive, close-range attackers built for rapid engagements in confined waters. One vessel would come to symbolize this transformation more clearly than any other: PT-59. Originally constructed as a standard 80-foot Elco motor torpedo boat, PT-59 entered service in 1942. Like its sisters, it was fast, lightly built, and armed with torpedoes and machine guns. But by mid-1943, the realities of combat demanded something different. The boat was refitted. Its torpedo tubes were removed. In their place came a 40mm Bofors gun mounted forward, a weapon capable of firing powerful explosive shells at a high rate. Additional 20mm cannons were installed. Twin 50-caliber machine guns were positioned to maximize coverage. Armor plating was added in critical areas to protect the crew from small arms fire. The result was no longer a classic torpedo boat, it was a gunboat. The philosophy behind the redesign was practical. In tight island channels of the Solomon chain, engagements often unfolded at distances too short for torpedoes to be effective. Reaction time was measured in seconds. A boat that could unleash rapid, concentrated gunfire immediately had the advantage. PT-59's transformation reflected lessons written in blood and experience. In late 1943, a young naval officer took command of the refitted boat, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. Earlier that year, Kennedy had commanded PT-109, which had been cut in half by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri during a night operation. The collision killed 2 crew members. Kennedy and the survivors endured days in open water and on small islands before being rescued, an ordeal that later became one of the most famous survival stories of the war. After recovering from injuries, Kennedy returned to duty. He was assigned to PT-59, now a gunboat rather than a torpedo craft. Under Kennedy's command, PT-59 operated around the islands of Vella La Vella and Choiseul. The missions were different from the classic torpedo runs imagined before the war.
Instead of hunting cruisers in open sea, the boat supported marine patrols, rescued stranded personnel, and provided suppressive fire along jungle coastlines. In one notable operation, PT-59 assisted in evacuating Marines trapped behind enemy lines on Choiseul Island. The boat crept close to shore under cover of darkness, its guns ready. Japanese positions overlooked the coastline. Any noise, any sudden light could trigger return fire. The heavier armament of the gunboat configuration proved essential. If enemy forces opened fire, PT-59 could respond instantly with 40mm and 20mm shells, explosive rounds capable of silencing machine gun nests or forcing defenders to take cover. Instead of relying on a single torpedo strike and retreat, the gunboat could sustain engagement long enough to protect troops embarking or disembarking. This shift from torpedo attacker to support vessel marked a fundamental evolution in doctrine. PT boats were no longer seen solely as offensive strike weapons against major ships. They had become multi-role platforms: ambush hunters, coastal raiders, escort craft, and floating artillery pieces. Innovation did not come without risk. Adding heavier guns increased weight. Weight affected speed and balance. PT boats depended on agility to survive. Engineers had to calculate carefully how much armament a wooden hull could carry without compromising performance. Decks were reinforced with steel plates. Mounts were carefully secured to distribute recoil. The boats remained vulnerable. They were still wooden vessels, but their bite had grown sharper. Crews adapted as well. Gunners trained to coordinate fire. Captains adjusted tactics to exploit sustained firepower rather than single high-speed torpedo passes. Instead of approaching silently, firing, and fleeing, gunboats sometimes engaged in brief but intense firefights before withdrawing at top speed. In narrow channels where Japanese barges moved at night, the effect was dramatic. A gunboat could close in and unleash a storm of shells, shredding multiple targets in quick succession. The 40mm Bofors, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, proved devastating against wooden craft and shore installations. The 20mm cannons added rapid-fire precision. Machine guns swept decks clean. The psychological impact on enemy forces intensified. Japanese supply crews now faced small boats capable not only of surprise, but of sustained explosive assault. The sudden thunder of multiple cannons in the darkness reinforced the growing reputation of these craft as something more dangerous than their size suggested. By late 1943 and into 1944, the gunboat configuration spread beyond a single vessel. Other PT boats underwent similar modifications. The torpedo, while still carried on many boats, was no longer sacred. Practicality ruled over tradition. The Pacific War rewarded flexibility. On islands like Bougainville, PT gunboats supported amphibious landings, patrolled rivers, and intercepted coastal traffic. Their shallow draft allowed them to operate where larger ships could not follow. Their guns allowed them to dominate small-scale engagements. This adaptability foreshadowed future naval warfare. Decades later, in conflicts like Vietnam, riverine gunboats would again patrol narrow waterways, heavily armed and designed for close combat. The concept had roots in these Pacific experiments, when small wooden boats were transformed under fire into floating gun platforms. For the men aboard them, however, the innovation was not theoretical. It meant survival. When engines roared in darkness and tracers cut across black water, heavier guns meant better odds. It meant being able to answer shore fire immediately. It meant rescuing stranded Marines without being overrun. PT-59 and boats like it represented more than mechanical modification. They represented the relentless adaptation of a Navy fighting thousands of miles from home, learning from every encounter. The Devil Boat legend, whispered among enemy crews and remembered by American sailors, was born not from a single weapon, but from this spirit of innovation. A small boat, once defined by torpedoes, had evolved into something more versatile and, in many situations, more deadly. In the Pacific night, amid reefs and jungle shores, the gunboat ruled through speed, surprise, and concentrated fire. And as the war pushed onward towards the Philippines and beyond, these lessons, learned under fire, would shape how small craft were viewed forever. From aircraft cannons in the sky to reinforced gun mounts at sea, the boundary between air power and naval firepower had blurred. The tiny boats had changed, and in doing so, they had changed the fight. By 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had clearly turned. American forces were advancing steadily westward through the Central Pacific, across the Marshalls, the Marianas, and toward the Philippines. Massive carrier fleets now dominated open ocean battles. New aircraft, new ships, and overwhelming industrial production reshaped the strategic picture. In this vast machinery of war, it would have been easy for the small wooden PT boats to fade into obscurity. But their story did not end quietly. The transformation from torpedo boat to heavily armed gunboat had proven something important. Innovation in wartime does not always come from grand shipyards or long-term planning. Sometimes it emerges from necessity, from sailors and officers adapting to the reality in front of them. The so-called devil boats were a product of that necessity. They were never large enough to win fleet engagements. They did not carry the firepower of cruisers or the armor of destroyers. Yet in confined waters, along jungle coasts, inside lagoons, across narrow straits, they became dominant. Their greatest contribution was not measured in tonnage sunk, but in disruption. By attacking Japanese barge traffic, they strangled supply lines. By harassing nighttime movements, they forced enemy commanders to divert resources to protection and escort. By providing close-in fire support to Marines and Army units, they directly influenced ground operations. In the Pacific, logistics determined survival. A garrison without ammunition or food could not hold its position for long. PT gunboats helped tip that balance repeatedly in places rarely remembered by name but crucial to the broader campaign. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, PT boats operated in the Philippines, around New Guinea, and in Borneo. Their missions diversified even further. Some were used for reconnaissance. Others inserted and extracted guerrilla fighters behind enemy lines. They carried supplies, evacuated wounded soldiers, and conducted patrols in rivers and shallow coastal waters where larger ships dared not venture. The heavy gun configurations remained part of this evolving role. Torpedoes still had value against larger ships, but by the later stages of the war, Japanese naval power had diminished significantly. The opportunities for classic torpedo attacks became rarer. Instead, small boat warfare increasingly revolved around coastal dominance, suppressing shore positions, intercepting small craft, and controlling waterways. In this environment, the gunboat concept proved its worth again and again. The idea that began with mounting powerful weapons on compact platforms, an idea visible in the nose cannon of the Bell P-39 Airacobra, had found lasting expression at sea. The lesson was simple but profound. Mobility combined with concentrated firepower could offset size and armor. After the war ended in 1945, PT boats were quickly retired. Their wooden hulls, worn by salt and tropical heat, were not built for decades of peacetime service. Many were scrapped. A few were preserved. Their crews returned home, carrying memories of humid nights, roaring engines, and sudden flashes of gunfire across black water. Yet the doctrine they helped shape endured.
In later decades, naval strategists would once again confront conflicts fought not on open oceans, but in confined waterways, rivers, deltas, coastal inlets. During the Vietnam War, the United States Navy deployed heavily armed river patrol boats designed specifically for close combat in narrow channels. These vessels, like their Pacific predecessors, relied on speed, agility, and overwhelming gunfire. The DNA of the Devil boats was unmistakable. Small hull, heavy weapons, aggressive tactics. Even modern fast attack craft and literal combat concepts reflect similar thinking. In an age of advanced missiles and electronics, the core principle remains relevant. In restricted environments, flexibility and rapid firepower matter more than sheer size. But beyond tactical evolution, the story of these boats carries a human dimension. The crews who manned them were often young, barely out of training, thrust into one of the most demanding naval environments in history. They operated in darkness with limited support, navigating reefs and enemy patrols by instinct. Mechanical failures could mean disaster. A single well-placed shell could ignite fuel or detonate ammunition stored on deck. Courage was not optional, it was routine. When Japanese sailors described sudden encounters with fast, heavily armed American boats, the fear they felt was real. The roar of engines, the blinding flare of searchlights, the thunder of cannons at close range. For men on wooden barges or lightly defended positions, it must have felt like an attack from nowhere, swift, violent, and gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Nicknames born in combat often reflect emotion more than official designation. Whether whispered in frustration or shouted in alarm, the idea of devil boats captured the shock these vessels could deliver. For American crews, however, there was nothing supernatural about it. There was exhaustion, sweat, mosquitoes, the smell of fuel and cordite, the constant vibration of engines beneath their feet, the knowledge that the darkness concealed both targets and threats. They were innovators not by choice, but by circumstance. When torpedoes proved unreliable, they adapted. When missions changed, they modified their boats. When firepower was lacking, they added more. The transformation of PT boats into gunboats was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a gradual, practical evolution shaped by frontline reality. And that may be their greatest legacy. War often highlights massive machines, aircraft carriers, battleships, bombers, but history is equally shaped by smaller platforms and the people who operate them. The Pacific Campaign was not won solely by fleet engagements. It was won through control of supply lines, through night patrols, through relentless pressure on enemy logistics. In that grinding, often unseen struggle, the tiny wooden gunboats played their part. As the war ended and the world shifted toward a new era, their story risked being overshadowed by larger narratives, yet their influence remained embedded in naval thinking. They demonstrated that innovation thrives under pressure. They proved that heavy firepower does not belong exclusively to large platforms. They showed that in the right hands, even a small craft can dominate its environment. From the unusual nose cannon of an aircraft to reinforced decks on wooden boats slicing through Pacific darkness, the journey was unlikely, almost improvised, but it worked. And in the black waters of the Solomon Islands, in the sudden thunder of night engagements, and in the shattered remains of enemy barges drifting under jungle shadows, the legend of the devil boats was written. Not in myth, but in wood, steel, fire, and courage.